All right, welcome, folks, to Grounding Thoughts for Panicky Times, Indigenous Approaches to Teaching, Learning, Being, and Knowing with Dr. Shannon Leddy. My name's Lee Bevington. I'm faculty at KPU. I want to start us off in a good way and acknowledge the traditional unceded territories that I'm on right now with the Coast Salish peoples. I'm on an island known as Skathak. Skathak is the name of this island as it's spoken in Sinchothan by the Wasanj peoples. I'm also a third generation colonial settler with European ancestry. And in addition to the territorial acknowledgement, I do also want to state that the process of decolonization, as I understand it, is an ongoing, continuous one that involves dismantling colonial mindsets and structures. And to borrow some words of Tuck and Eve, it also involves the repatriation of Indigenous culture and Indigenous lands. Thank you for joining us. I'm really excited. We have lots of folks here, which is great to see. If anyone wants to post in the chat where you are coming from, the city or territories or the campus that you're at today, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat in whatever way works for you and share a bit about yourself if you'd like to do so. I do want to mention that this is part of a community of practice on decolonizing educational practices, which is co-facilitated by myself and Tanya Bernstad, who's also here, and who's from the Learning Centers. So this is part of that community of practice. And if folks are interested in joining that community of practice, I will put the link into the chat there. You can find more info. I do want to thank a number of areas of KPU that are supporting this series, including this webinar today, the Office of the Provost, Teaching and Learning Commons, the Learning Centers, and KPU Wild Spaces. In case you don't know who I am a learning strategist at KPU with Learning Centers. I'm also an interdisciplinary instructor, and I'm the coordinator of KPU Wild Spaces, which engages in outdoor place-based learning. But I want to shift over to Shannon now and introduce our speaker here today. So Shannon actually and I did our master's together in arts ed a while ago at SFU. I still remember that class, an embodiment with Celeste Snober and going kayaking and dancing and all sorts of really cool things that my students then got to try afterwards. But the more official introduction of Shannon now. So Dr. Shannon Leddy is a card-carrying member of the Métis Nation of BC and an associate professor of art education at the University of British Columbia, whose practice focuses on using transformative pedagogies in decolonizing and indigenizing teacher education. Shannon is the co-author of Teaching Where You Are, Weaving Indigenous and Slope Principles and Pedagogies. Her research sits at the intersection of Indigenous, art-based education, and sustainability, and focuses on uplifting Indigenous voices and knowledges within educational practices. Before arriving at UBC, Shannon taught high school art, social studies, English. She's the co-chair of the Institute for Environmental Learning and a research fellow with the Institute for Public Education. She's also a mother, Nehiyah/Cree language learner, and a Danish language learner. So please join me in warmly welcoming Shannon Leddy today. Over to you, Shannon.
Oh, it would be helpful if I unmuted, wouldn't it? Tanse nitotomek. Hello, my friends. Tawa, welcome. Shannon Leddy Nitikasan, Ochinia, Saskatoon, Treaty 6 Territory, Equa, Vancouver. I am coming to you from the unceded and traditional territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people in Vancouver today, land that is shared by the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Pardon me, I'm originally from Treaty 6 in Saskatoon. And I am Métis on my father's side and second generation Irish Canadian on my mother's side. My father's grandmother, Mabel Monkman, was from St. Louis, Saskatchewan, which is one of the traditional Métis communities. And I am so grateful to Lee for inviting me to speak yet again with Kwantlen instructors, students, faculty, and various others. I really appreciate these opportunities to share what I'm thinking about right now. And this presentation in particular, as Lee, when I got on the line with Lee, I had to say, I'm sorry I was late. I first had to log in, and then my husband's doctor called me, and then blah, 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 blah. So, I'm really familiar with this sort of constant feeling of panic that maybe accompanies us in academic life, but is also part of how we're trying to, or how we're forced to live in the world right now with all of the climate anxiety, geopolitical upheaval. I get regular doses of rage watching the evening comics at this point, listening to, the unwinding of environmental policies in America, the instability that happens in so many places, and working with kids and young people from grade 3 and 4 all the way up to, university students, graduate students. Everyone is feeling these big feelings right now. And I think it's really important that we think about how do we address those in our classrooms, in our lives, with our families, with ourselves? How do we find ways to feel grounded in the good parts of the world rather than, this living on the constant verge of the feeling of collapse? And I'm going to start by reminding us all of something that the American children's television star Mr. Rogers used to say in these times, look for the helpers. And I think that's maybe the first thing that we need to consider when we think about how do we nurture our own feelings of wellness and well-being when we see so much evidence of chaos all around us. So today we're going to walk through the medicine wheel. I've got a couple of thoughts on each of the cardinal directions, and a couple of ideas around things that you might be able to include in your own practice or consider as you're working on developing courses or teaching courses. And then I think there will be time for questions at the end. So I will, without any further ado, get her going. So we start always in the medicine wheel and my teachings in the East, which is where the sun rises. It is, if you think about the medicine wheel as being related in part to the cycles of life, it's our infancy. It is the home of the spirit, and it's where we begin to form relationships with the material and the non-material world, begin to grow, begin to dream, develop goals and visions and theories. It's the nascence of our being, and it's a really important one to keep in mind. And one, the spirit is something that we don't often talk about, particularly within post-secondary education, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist for many of us in many ways and that it doesn't need to be addressed. So sometimes even making allowance for the idea of spirit is a part of helping oneself and one's students become grounded. Recently, I have responded to a call for papers on joy-centered pedagogy. And when I sent my abstract in, I wrote to the publisher, I am so grateful that you put this call out, even if you don't accept my, offering. I had such a good time doing the research and was reminded of so many important things that joy can bring to us and the prospect of joy. In particular, I've been working with groups of grade 3 and 4 students and 5 and 6 students at a school in Vancouver and some high school students as well. Having been a high school teacher, I'm less excited about those guys, but the little kids, they're so full of playfulness and joy. And we've been doing arts-based research with them on their complex understandings of climate change. And sitting in the classroom with those students, I am reminded, and particularly before Christmas, at the end of a teaching term, my son's father had just passed away. I was having like these autoimmune outbreaks, and it just felt like there was no joy in my life. But watching these kids, I was reminded that it's actually available to us all of the time. And I think particularly in play and in art making practices, there's so much potential for joy, so much uh, you know, just the excitement of being able to play with paints, being able to make something that does it doesn't matter what you make. There's no judgment, there's no, there's no recriminations. These kids are just full of light and life. And so some of the research that I engaged with was a paper by M.K. Johnson and a paper by H.K. Sloan, one being more sort of quantitative and psychologically oriented, and the other being more philosophically oriented. And these two quotes really emerged for me about the importance of joy as a way of attuning us to being open to possibilities and relating to our circumstances in a new light. And that joy and the prospect of joy are instrumental in striving for self-preservation. So finding those opportunities within our classrooms, creating chances for people to make art, to get dirty, to get outside, to breathe, to be with one another, to get that spirit of community and learning going in the classroom. I think that's one of the most important things we can give our students. And it's actually not as hard as having full watercolor sets. You can make art with just about anything in the world. It's just a matter of making space for that in our curriculum. And the longer I work in post-secondary education, the more I'm aware that it is not the volume of reading we assign our students that is important in their learning. It's the quality of the readings that we assign. And when we assign fewer readings, we allow our students to engage more deeply with them. And I think that's a really important part of helping them to find joy as well. We don't want them to feel crushed by our courses, especially when they're taking multiple courses. We want them to feel invited into learning with us. So making space for other ways of knowing and being as part of our work is important. The second thing I think in this quadrant is the importance of being really relationally engaged with our students and with the world around us. And to be in relationship implies an ethical responsibility to maintain balance and well-being. So remembering too that we are teaching people, we're not teaching subjects. Relationships are not just about person to person, they're also about the more than human world. And they're also about our relationships to the ideas that we encounter and share with our students. So, nurturing genuine engagement, nurturing ways in which students can see themselves within the materials, the curricular materials that we're offering them, and nurturing their ability to speak with one another about those curricular materials is an important part of our work. One of the things that the medicine wheel offers as a holistic framework is that each quadrant represents an aspect of our holistic selfhood. Many of you are probably quite familiar, or at least passingly familiar with the medicine wheel already, but thinking in ways that take into account each of those quadrants in our relationships with our students may also be really important to helping both ourselves and them feel more grounded. In the South, we have the emotional quadrant, and this is in the work that we did in the book, we linked each of the quadrants to Verna Kirkness's 4 Rs. And so we felt that the South was the quadrant of relevance. And that means that we need to figure out how it is that we are interacting with curricular materials, elders, scholars, and other educators to nurture our growing sense of our relationship with the world and to ensure that what we are engaging with our students in our classrooms is actually relevant to their lives. And sometimes even things that don't seem relevant, in the black and white copy of an article can actually be made relevant when we engage other aspects of our emotional selves and imagination and that spiritual element as well to really bring them to life and show the ways in which they're relevant in the world. Um, this is also the quadrant where I think it's really important to think about what does it mean to engage in trauma-informed approaches to not just teaching and learning, but to our lives as well. A number of years ago, I did and just part of some of the work that I'm doing with residential school survivor stories has had me do a lot of research on what it means to be trauma informed. And basically, it means we need to understand how violence, victimization, and other traumatic experiences may have figured into the lives of the individuals that we're teaching, may have factored into our own lives. And we need to take that into consideration when we're addressing just about anything in the classroom. As a former high school teacher, there were a number of times when I would be teaching a lesson, not thinking too much that, that there was anything that was going to trigger anyone in the classroom, only to look up and discover that someone was crying and had clearly been crying for a while. And I hadn't noticed or I hadn't understood how what I was bringing into the room might be impacting one of the young students in the classroom. So this research that I did, years after that, has really been important in helping me rethink how we address difficult subjects in the room, or even when we think subjects are not going to be difficult for us, how we might account for the challenges that our students may face. Most of us do arrive in our classrooms with histories of trauma of one kind or another. And I think it's really important to take that into consideration, especially, if a student gives us a response that we're not too sure about or that seems disproportionate or even inappropriate. It's really good to take a step back and to think about what it might be in their life that is triggering them to respond in the way that they're responding, and to then take the responsibility of helping work through them. Some strategies, to sort of some preventative strategies, might be to consider things like, when you went to the doctor's office when you were little and you got a shot, maybe the doctor gave you a lollipop. If you know that you're going to be addressing something that's difficult in your class, maybe it's an important time to think about canceling a reading, ending class early, offering extensions to those that are feeling challenged by the topic, or bring in some food to share at the end of the class. None of this is to minimize students' responses or to, try to erase what their feelings are, but rather to try to create a community. And I think sometimes eating together or getting some kind of treat together is a really important part of recognizing we're all in this together. And food really is healing. My son, at one point in the last number of years, had a couple of sort of low-key panic attacks about things. And I remembered reading somewhere that you can't have a panic attack and eat an apple at the same time. So though, because it's a grounding thing, it's actually a food, a sensation that's in your mouth, and your body is forced to refocus on what's actually happening rather than what you are worried about happening in the world. So there really are some benefits to working in ways that maybe include food, or that make it available if you are having someone who is really, really struggling with themselves in the moment. And then creating talking circles in the classroom, I think, is also a good way of establishing trauma-informed ways of working together in the room, because it's a sort of a democratizing force. And if you follow traditional talking circle protocols, the idea is that only one person speaks at a time. Everyone in the circle has the opportunity to speak, and only the person holding the talking object, or holding the attention of the class if you don't have a talking object, is the one who is able to speak. And everyone also has the right to pass. So people don't have to share if they're not ready to share. But through all of this research into trauma-informed approaches, it was also drawn to my attention that we need to think about creating brave spaces rather than safe spaces. And I think this is on another slide, but it certainly applies here. And it's largely because we cannot really actually ensure the safety of our students in our classrooms, but we can establish trustworthiness, we can maximize choice, we can maximize collaboration, and we can prioritize their impersonal empowerment. And speaking in a circle where everyone has the chance to hear without, or to speak without being interrupted, and to listen to others without doing that, background work of formulating their rebuttal, is a really important part of creating that good spirit in the room and taking care of our emotional selves, especially if we're dealing with challenging topics. Another thing that we need to think about for our students is modeling self-regulation. I remember when I first started teaching, there was still, which was more than 20 years ago now, there was still this idea that teachers needed to be neutral, that we needed to, as professionals, sort of hang up our personal lives at the door and just carry on as though we were kept on a shelf or in a closet until it was time to teach, at which point, and when we finished, we would go back into the closet. We had no feelings, no bodily functions, nothing like that. That was not a possibility for me. And I found that often, especially as a single parent, and maybe particularly as a single parent doing a PhD, I was sometimes arriving at school feeling like a bit of a mess, and I still had to grapple with my students. So I devised this strategy of having my rescue hero on my desk, and usually the sign pointed out with the green that said it's safe to speak to Miss Letty, but every once in a while, if I really wasn't feeling okay, I would turn the sign to the red side so that students would know maybe this isn't the best time to ask me about, whatever thing you're going to ask me about. Give me a few minutes and we can come back and chat again later when the storm cloud is lifted, which it always does. No one is ever upset for very long, but every once in a while. And only once in all of my years of teaching did I ever start a conversation with a student where the sign was on the green side, and partway through the conversation, I just reached over and turned the sign to the red side so that the student would recognize this isn't going maybe how you thought it was going to go. And we were able to get through the rest of the conversation all right. But I think it is really important for us to model that we're not always perfect, we're not always 100%, but we do have to have ways as adults of managing ourselves, and those are usually transferable to other people as well. Moving on to the West, pardon me, in the physical realm, where we might match with reciprocity, we engage with the material world beyond merely moving our bodies and think about how we might work with our feelings and non-material world in relationship to this quadrant. So it's easy to think about the material as just being about the body, but I think it's actually more about embodiment and in the kinds of pedagogical approaches we might take. So in this physical world, I've actually included storytelling and arts-based approaches because they're often kinetic. Transdisciplinary learning, things that take us from, not just the subject that we're considering together, but make connections to other areas of curriculum or other aspects of the world. Experiential learning, things that allow us to move our bodies and our hands in relation to what we're learning. Multimodal learning, challenging our brains in different ways and honoring those people that have learning preferences that are maybe more auditory or learning preferences that are maybe more visual. And co-learning is really important as well. We, as educators, recognize we are not the experts on everything. We know lots of things about a couple of subjects, but we can't possibly know everything. So I think to have the humility to position ourselves as co-learners with our students and invite that learning together is a really important aspect of this particular quadrant and how we do things in a good way. It is about connecting with the land, though, and if we consider our land as a first teacher, that certainly leads us to new ways of thinking about how we might engage with curriculum. And ethical relationality then becomes important as well. If we are taking from the land, even ideas or harvesting or gathering, we need to give something back. When we're taking ideas from other scholars, we give something back by honoring their work, pardon me, by citing their work. And that's something that we need to model for our students as well. Remembering that we're teaching human beings, not subjects. So, it's not art that I teach. I teach people about how to work with teaching art to other people, teaching ways of making, teaching ways of measuring, of imagining, of actualizing. But it's all about the people. It's also important to engage our metaphoric imagination because this often can allow students ways in that maybe would not be available to them otherwise. Not everyone has a very literal mind, and many of us think in pictures, and so it's easier for us to understand something when we get a mental picture of what that looks like rather than just reading the words on a text. And then to borrow a little bit from the First People's Principles of Learning, which are certainly big in all of the high schools and teacher education programs in our province, Learning is holistic, relational, experiential, and needs to be student-led. So we need to think about what our students need from us as much as we think about what it is we can give to them. I'm sorry for the recurrent throat clearing. I'm at the end of the cold that everybody has had, and it's just lingering in these slightly annoying ways. So my apologies for that noise. We do need to connect with the land in this quadrant as well. And it's really important for us to do that in order to be able to connect with ourselves. The land is our first teacher, and it is a curriculum that has its own pedagogies. If you think about some of the creatures that live on the land, a bee will teach you how to treat a bee. If you treat it poorly, you'll get stung, right? So I think, and that is a pedagogy of how to get along with bees. There are ways of approaching them, there are ways of working with them that are not going to result in stinging or any kind of bad interactions. And I think the entire plant world, water world, sky world is all like that. Everything shows us how it wants to be treated. I think we also need to help our students shift away from seeing the land as a site of development, agriculture, and recreation, and remember to see it as our relative, as the thing that gives us life and gives everything life so that we can all live together. I love the assertion that the land does not belong to us. Rather, we belong to the land. So, how do we engage in our teaching practices in our daily lives in ways that give back to the land, that honor our sense of responsibility and the need for reciprocity with the land, rather than just being consumers and people that see the land only as the site of recreation and physical challenge? It's so much more than that. And I think, this is one that could also belong in the spiritual quadrant as well. This is a photo that I took at the Wichichichem Garden at UBC, a place that I spend a lot of time and plan to spend a lot more time this year. If you've never been there, it's at the UBC farm, and it is the most gentle and loving learning space where you can learn all about plant medicines and our plant relatives. And I encourage you to take some time and go hang out there this summer if you're able to. It's just wonderful. And you can, if you need some like physical therapy, you can do weeding. There's all kinds of jobs that you can volunteer to do at the garden. So that's a really good way of engaging in the land and grounding yourself back on what's important. 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I made it a commitment to volunteer at the garden for a couple of hours every week. And I discovered that because they keep the soil so rich and so moist and so well cared for, the biggest pleasure for me at that garden is getting those really sharp, tall, like Scotch thistle kind of weeds, because if you grab them at the right spot, they pull out of the garden like magic. And honestly, it is so satisfying. In our work, often we don't get to see the results of our efforts. And it's always this sort of deferred gratification. And we get to see our students maybe when they cross the platform at convocation. But this is some immediate gratification, and I highly recommend it as a way to come back to yourself and remember what we can do to be one with the land and to help all of those plant medicines grow. Pardon me. Finally, the last quadrant is the northern quadrant. It's the quadrant of our elderhood, of our wisdom. It's the intellectual quadrant, and I think it's also the quadrant of responsibility. By the time we get to be elders in whatever sense, or at least educators, leaders, we have to be responsible for seeing how things fit together. Beyond synthesis, it means recognizing the interconnection of all things and ideas and creating the kinds of interdisciplinary learning opportunities that will make space for students to see those connections as well. So I guess this is where I had the note about brave spaces rather than safe spaces. Um, Fostering those conditions for respectful dialogue is a really important part of how we can help our students ground ourselves right now. And thinking back to that idea of the circle pedagogy, or circle dialogue, that fits really well with this idea of fostering conditions for respectful dialogue, because I think it's a way of sort of decolonizing the physical spaces of our classroom, to move desks out of the way, or to actually leave the classroom and to stand and sit in a circle, stand or sit in a circle outdoors or in a larger space. That directly works against the colonial systems that we've inherited and the anti-Indigenous racism that often informs them. And it helps us develop new understandings and resources and pedagogies that move both ourselves and our students into new ways of learning together. Um, and this doesn't always happen in a circle, but certainly when you democratize the classroom, when you remove sort of that head of the classroom positioning for yourself as the teacher, when you disrupt any of the kinds of power relationships or dynamics that have developed in the classroom based on where people sit or with whom they sit, and put all of those folks into a circle, it diffuses some tensions that may exist and that we may not even recognize existed until we begin to feel them dissipate. But I think it's also really important to recognize that there is no way of guaranteeing safe spaces for our students. We can't guarantee their emotional safety or their intellectual safety. So we have to work instead for brave spaces where people are encouraged to have the agency to speak their truths, and where others are encouraged to listen deeply and to not engage, as I said earlier, in that sort of thinking about what my rebuttal is going to be, but really listen to someone else's truth. It takes as much courage to sit still and listen with intention as it does to speak your truth. And I think we need to find ways to demonstrate that for our students through living this practice in our classrooms. I also think humor is so important in our work. I got to go to the Vancouver Art Gallery with my partner a couple of weeks ago and encountered this sculpture. All of these sculptures are by Bo Dick, the late great Bo Dick. But this one in particular, I had never seen before, and it absolutely delighted me. And it reminded me of some work that I've done in the past about the importance of humor as an aspect of pedagogy in Indigenous education. Humor humanizes us, and I think particularly for Indigenous people, in the wake of the Truth and Reconciliation report and all of the practices that we've been encouraged to engage in since then, sometimes it feels like we can become too trauma focused, and that really collapses Indigenous identities to, something around victimhood or people that are, constantly only live in these oppressive ways. But really, Indigenous people are hilarious and bright and creative and complex, just like everybody else. So when we remind ourselves that humor is an important part of the work that we do, that kind of opens up maybe how our students have been thinking about some of the people and subjects they have been reading about, and it allows that full breadth of humanity to infuse our understandings. Humor can also be culturally relevant, particularly if you're reading novels by Indigenous authors. You can recognize the ways in which humor can maintain social order, show acceptance, and offer opportunities for self-reflection through satire. You may also have been in Indigenous spaces at ceremony or at public gatherings like powwows, and witness that in action. And when you're being teased by someone, particularly in Indigenous communities, which is the same as many other communities, that's when you know they really accept you. When you've got yourself a nickname, you're part of the crew. And that's a really good feeling as well. And finally, humor can be very soothing. We need levity to get us through the hard times. There's an awful lot of sort of black humor or gallows humor available, often in Indigenous circles, or anywhere where there's been tragedy. We sometimes need to engage in that kind of humor because it helps remind us that we are still on the right side of the grass, and that means we get to keep living. And humor is part of what I think makes life worth living. So I encourage that as a grounding practice as well. Not all humor lands, well with everybody. And certainly there are different kinds of humor and different theories of humor. Any humor that degrades someone else or that is meant to belittle, the target of the joke is not a welcome kind of humor in the classroom, but certainly humor that teases us a little bit about who we are or how we might be impacting others, that can be a really useful way of managing and navigating together. I think another thing that I think about a lot is the idea of teaching like an artist. And if you've ever, for example, worked with clay, you really need to know the properties of clay in order to understand its limitations. No one has ever said, gee, this pair of ceramic underwear is super comfortable, because no one would make underwear out of ceramics. It doesn't work. That's not a reasonable material property, at least not for something that you're actually going to use in your life. So you have to, think about what are the raw materials that you're working with? What are the qualities of your students, of the people in the room, that are going to help you work with rather than against what they're doing, what they want to accomplish, what the spirit in the room is. When you force things, when you force clay to get too thin or too high, when you force wood to, when you like try to carve against the grain, you're going to break things. When you force things, they break. But I think knowing how to work with the materials you've got is a really important part of being successful in creating the outcome that you'd like to have. I think we also need to stay humble. We are definitely going to break things from time to time. There will be students in the classroom crying. Somebody will get upset or offended, but we need to learn from those mistakes, and we need to be able to forgive when those mistakes happen and to be able to ask forgiveness when we're the ones that have made the mistakes. And I think that's a really important part of our work as well. It's easy to, get up in our own heads about our importance as PhDs or professors or administrators or whatever roles we have. But really, if we are all the same underneath. We all have the same needs, and when there isn't anyone who's better than anyone else, and we need to have that humility to be able to repair relationships when they start to fall apart a little bit. This is an image by Nicholas Galanin, who is an artist that I absolutely love. And it's just another example of sort of the combination of humor and art together. And I don't know why I thought live long and prosper and may the force be with you was a good way to end this slide, but I did, and there it is. And here you are. It's it's going well, don't you think? Sure. Okay, so putting it all together. So this is not something that we're going to do today, but it is something that I would like to encourage you to do at some point, especially if after this particular discussion together, you kind of want to figure out ways to extend how you might work with the medicine wheel in your own teaching practice. Find a copy of the First People's Principles of Learning, which is really easy to find online. You can Google them, print them out, cut them into strips, and then print out a medicine wheel as well. And take some time as a group to figure out which of the quadrants of the medicine wheel each one of the First People's Principles of Learning fits within. I've also got the suggestion that you could write a relationship, respect, reciprocity, and relevance for each one of, for each, pardon me, on each quadrant of the medicine wheel as well. But it's a really instructive practice to work through thinking about these First People's Principles of Learning together and trying to locate them within the medicine wheel. I'm going to tell you right now, you'll probably find that many of them end up wanting to be in the middle because all of them relate to just about every aspect of the medicine wheel. But it's just like a good, kinesthetic way of learning together and thinking together about how we might change our practices to make them more grounded in our humanness and in interconnectedness and in, this holistic way of thinking about who we are in classrooms. In the slide here, we've also actually got some of the tenets of slow pedagogy. So the idea that it's not a project, it's not about how long it takes. You could also find those tenets and do the same activity with the medicine wheel, but I think it's a really good way of continuing as a community of practice together and thinking about how we decolonize and recenter our human students in our practice rather than the curriculum or the content that we want to get on the table for them. That is actually my last slide. I think I spoke more quickly than I meant to, but it's okay. These are just a couple of closing thoughts that I think are important. First of all, the phrase in Cree, we say kakyao wagamaganak, and that is the translation is all my relations. And I think it's really important that it reminds us that we are in this together. Sean Wilson, in his book Research as Ceremony, has reminded us that we are the relationships we hold and we are and we are part of. So I think that's a really important phrase and consideration for thinking about who we are and the work that we do in post-secondary institutions, whether we're students or educators or preparing to be educators, remembering that we don't have relationships, we are relationships. A couple of other key concepts, particularly from Cree, even though I'm Métis, I'm from Saskatoon, where there's huge Cree population. So a lot of my early teachings were sort of blended between Métis community teachings and Cree teachings, and I always go back to these words. But the idea of Wakotowin, the kinship and interconnectedness of all things, beings, systems, and communities. I was once told that that was probably the closest word that Cree people have for the traditional word that Cree people might have for science because of that notion of interconnectedness. Nothing is separable. Everything is related to everything else. And when you impact something over here, it's going to have an impact on something over there. So keeping that in mind as part of being grounded as well, that if you're hungry, you might not relate as well to the people that you're speaking with. If you've got a pain in your knee or your hip, you might not be, relating well enough. And other people are bringing those same ailments or discomforts as well. So how do we take those into account and make spaces where it's okay to be like that? It's okay to need to move or sit in particular ways because everything is connected and everything is therefore important. Another key concept is that of Mino Pimatisuin, or living in a good way, living a good life. So keeping in good relations with all beings and things. How do we, back to that idea that the land, we belong to the land rather than the land belongs to us. How do we embody that notion in the ways that we live every day? We can't be perfect. Sometimes you're going to get a takeaway coffee cup. Sometimes you're going to have to drive rather than walk or take the bus. Sometimes we're going to have to do things that are sort of out of balance with what is in the best interest of the entire planet. But I think whenever we can to make decisions that help us live in the world in the ways that we really want to live and honor the values that we carry with us. I shouldn't say if, when you make a mistake, when I make a mistake, when any of us makes a mistake, we have to do our best to make a reparation. For many, many years, particularly in the K to 12 school system, and I would say in every single province in Canada, there was a lot of avoidance of working with Indigenous content and stories. And the one of the key excuses was often, well, I don't know any Indigenous people, I don't know enough, I'm afraid of making mistakes, I'm afraid of making someone angry. We don't do that with very many other subjects in the world. If you needed to teach Julius Caesar by William Shakespeare, you wouldn't say, sorry, I'm really afraid of, offending the entire Isle of Britain, so I don't really want to teach it because I don't know enough about it. You just get busy and learn and figure it out and find resources that would help to support your learning. We need to do that same work when it comes to decolonizing and Indigenous ways of thinking and knowing. And even though this, talk today has been about grounding, I think for me, those Indigenous ways of thinking and knowing are profoundly grounding. And so continuing to think about what does that mean in the classroom is a really important part of this work. And I want to end with the seven sacred teachings. They're borrowed from, I'm borrowing them from our Anishinaabe cousins. What would it mean if every day we approached our work, our lives, our families, our students, and ourselves with love, respect, courage, honesty, wisdom, humility, and truth? Those are all profoundly grounding values. And I think if we keep them at the forefront of our thinking as educators or as administrators or as students, we can't go very far wrong. And I think we'll find that giving out those giving out our love, our respect, our courage, and so on is going to mean that we get it back as well. So everything that comes around goes around, and we get what we give. So let's focus on giving those things as a way of making space and holding space for all those that we come into contact with. And I think in so doing, we'll find that we are better centered within ourselves. We're better rooted to the ground that we stand on. We're better able to work through the anxiety and panic of our lives and think about a future that is better for all of us together. So I'm going to stop sharing now. I'm going to have a sip of tea and I'm going to invite all of your questions and comments and concerns and even personal problems. As I said, I talked too fast, ended early, so we can talk about it all.
Thanks so much, Shannon. And the love is pouring in already, as you can see on the screen there. Um, so much richness there, rich learning. I love that idea of the bringing more joy into like every class we teach. How can we bring in joy? But not just classes or labs, like to meetings and other places. Like joy and humor could offer so much, and we need more of that right now. And I love there's so much, but in the pedagogical approaches, learning as holistic, relational, experiential, and student-led. I'm like, yes, speaking speaking my language, and that activity with the First People's principles of learning, cutting them up and putting them in place. I love that as well. It's because it's something we can actually do, right? We can take that and do that in our groups and our teams, etc. And maybe at KPU, we have the need KPU pathway to systemic transformation. That might be a way to bring that in as well. Um, so I could say a lot more, but I want to hear folks' questions. So I'm going to open it up. Uh, and if you can either put up your hand, you could post your question in the chat. You can probably just jump in and turn on your audio and video and ask a question. Um, so feel free to put your questions forward. Anyone want to start us off?
Hope I'll just, while we're waiting to see what, giving people a chance to think, I hope that that resonated for you. It's always challenging to present to a group of people because we're all starting at different places. And, for many of you, maybe I was preaching to the choir and telling you things that you already know. But sometimes I certainly find it helpful to have things reiterated to me because it's easy to get lost in the shuffle of daily life and the being needed here, being needed there. And so sometimes these are just reaffirmations, and I hope they were helpful. Thank you, Ambrose. I appreciate that.
I don't necessarily have, oh, sorry, Alex, did you have a question? Okay. I don't really have a question, but I just wanted to say that one thing that specifically resonated with me, Shannon, was when you were talking about brave spaces versus safe spaces. It was one of the topics that we sort of started discussing in the community of practice near the beginning. And I really like how you transitioned that into talking about including humor, because we tend to focus a lot on the seriousness of it because we understand the importance and we're carrying it as a weight, and then to realize that yes, okay, hey, we can be light about some of the topics because yes, it's fact-based, and yes, some of these things are not so great, but we are moving forward and finding humor. So that really resonated with me. And I imagine that it resonated a lot with everybody else in this room just because of conversations that we've had. So I really appreciated that aspect. Alex, I will share with you.
Thanks, Tanya. And Alex, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, sorry, just finding my audio. Yeah, thank you so much for this presentation. I really appreciated so many. I'm like remembering so many things. One of the things that I've been like trying to do more is the circle talking method, which I'm co-teaching with an Indigenous instructor, Anthony Fernandez, and he kind of encouraged me to do that and made me really uncomfortable the first time. And now I've adopted it in other classes. But I find that I am fighting the built infrastructure of our classrooms in order to do it. We don't always have movable desks.
Yeah.
When we do, it takes, it's like a lot of effort to move all the desks. And then if there's going to be slides later, do we put the, and so I'm just thinking about that and also just the teaching about, the land as a teacher and how nice it would be to just be able to go outside and have that circle outside, which I'm in Richmond. We can do that at the KPU farm, but it still takes up quite a lot of class time to walk over there. So, um, for one thing, it's making me think about um, the built environment as maybe something that comes into the conversation of this community of practice, like how we can advocate for more flexible spaces as part of the, teaching differently. And I'm also just curious what others are doing to, I don't know, do that upstream fight against the infrastructure of the classroom with circles.
I really appreciate that, Alex. Yeah, there are a couple of classrooms that I've taught in at UBC that have that precise problem. In fact, one of my first assignments was to teach these large lectures in a lecture theater, and it becomes impossible to create a talking circle, A, with that many people, for one, and B, with, yeah, immovable seats and all of that kind of thing. I think talking circles are probably generally best with groups of 20 or so, which is not always possible. Sometimes it may be, something that we need to sort of break down into smaller groups and then ask, how, if people want to share out what was talked about in talking circles, if that's what you have set up as one of the protocols, that things are shareable. Sometimes things are not shareable outside of a circle, but certainly that's one way. Um, yeah, and it can be really frustrating. I have done talking circles in hallways, not the kind where you're really getting something on the table, but just a sort of a check-in. And done talking circles just like on the grass in front of the building because there really isn't another space. And same with UBC Farm. It's a long walk from our scarf building out to the farm, and that just takes up way too much time. And even sometimes trying to start the farm doesn't give students enough time to get back to their classes, their next classes. So those challenges are real. But I will tell you that one of the first times I taught, I always start and end my classes with the talking circle. I don't do too many necessarily during the course of the term unless something has come up where we really need to get it on the table. But start and finish, always a circle. And there've been a couple of times where Indigenous students have come up to me after the first class and expressed gratitude for the fact that I had it set in a circle when they walked in so that it didn't feel like that colonial space that's triggering intergenerational memories or personal memories. So it's not easy, but I definitely encourage it. And I would be keen to hear if other people have solutions or other ideas about how to enact this kind of pedagogy, sort of auto pedagogy. I think that's important.
Thank you.
Just on the top of circles, one one thing I've learned is when there is walking time, and often I'm going outside, so there is walking time, is to incorporate that in as part of it. That walking can be a great time to informally connect with each other. So often it's just a great time to just de-stress and just move the body. So it offers something just on itself. But you can also give these little prompts of, hey, chat with someone about this idea, about this assignment or whatever, right? So that when you get there, they have something to share. So you can shift the idea of the walking as lost time, but actually something really valuable being gained. That being said, there's still so much you got to teach and cover. So you have to figure out what you also can let go of to allow this in more. It's a tricky balance, especially for content heavy courses. So, but always I find valuable when we have the chance to walk and share in different ways. I see, I think in the chat, a comment from Mark. Uh, Mark, did you want to speak to that, or I can read it out loud?
Um, sure. I was just kind of a side note to Alex to say that, yeah, faculty or instructors in the Faculty of Arts also um, very passionate about circle teaching and have similar frustrations with the classroom setup. And so that has been something that has been put forward to like the Dean of Arts. And I think they are planning to make some adjustments in terms of classroom infrastructure to make circle classrooms more of a possibility. But as I mentioned, I'm a little bit hazy on the details. But I can certainly ask and then get back to you because I feel like if there's examples in the Faculty of Arts that you can point to, it might make it easier for the Faculty of Sciences. But sort of side note, but I did want to say, yeah, thank you, Shannon. Such a fabulous workshop, and thank you for giving me permission as a white guy to, you know, engage, right? Because I think I am one of those people who have held back from bringing Indigenous content into the classroom because I sort of have this feeling of like, well, who am I, right? Like, who am I to, um, you know, I center material that uh, comes from Indigenous knowledge keepers when I am not Indigenous. So I feel like I've always had a little bit of hesitation on that. But from what I heard you saying, I can, uh, you know, with as much respect and care as possible, engage with that. So that's something that I'm taking away from this. So thank you. I don't really have any questions, but though I see Farhad has his hand up, so I'll mute myself. But thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, can I speak?
Please, yes.
Yeah, what a powerful, beautiful session today. Thank you to the speaker. Thank you to all the participants. I wanted to share how I do some of the work that the previous speaker was talking about before, Mark, around how challenging it is to teach in a circle and outdoors and with nature as the classroom. And it is challenging, and that has been my experience, and I know it's been Lee's experience too. But you can approach it from multiple paths. The big one and the hard one would be to encourage your students to go on a field school, especially one that is nature based like Amazon Field School. But there's others. That's a long road, right? But it's intense and it's transformative. But you can also, closer to your classroom, organize field trips. And you put it into your curriculum, and the students have a heads up. And you do have to spend some thought about how students will get to the site and how they will return and enough time for their next class. And I've done that. And sometimes I do it on a weekend. Sometimes I offer multiple days because when you do land-based teaching, it's better to have smaller size classes anyway, and you give students different options, and they can sign up for the slot that works for them best. But this is a very different way of teaching. It's a lot more involved. It's more work for you, but it's a dramatically more powerful experience for you as the instructor. What do they say? The juice is worth the squeeze. But also in class, sometimes if the weather is cooperative, I'll do a small outdoor session on a specific topic. We'll just go to the courtyard if it's Surrey campus. Langley campus has all kinds of opportunities. So does Cloverdale, so does Richmond. And you can do a specific activity, or you can invite your students to go out in pairs on campus and do an activity. I do an activity where they have to look at how Kwantlen is designed poorly in terms of accessibility issues, and they take photos and they bring it back to the class, and then we have a rich conversation. But they had gone out of the classroom. And then the other one you can do, which I've done with students who have certain accommodation needs, and perhaps they can't do it with the class, is I invite students to have a nature-based experience on their own time. They go to a park, they go to their backyard, to their garden or wherever. They have some objectives. They write about it, they do mindfulness activities, they do journaling, they take photos, they come back to class, they share that. So there are multiple different approaches to deal with these structural problems that were identified. And it asks us to be creative, it asks us to take risks, but that's what excites me as an educator anyway.
Thank you so much, Farad. Absolutely. I do a number of the things that you've suggested just now as well. And I appreciate your sharing that it's a challenge. It's not always easy, but it is definitely worth it. And I think it enriches students' connection with both themselves, with the course content, and with us as instructors. So thank you very much.
Of course.
Thank you all. We're coming towards the end of our time. If there's any final quick comments folks want to share either in the chat or otherwise, feel free to do so. Otherwise, I'm going to sort of start wrapping up, but feel free to share your comments in the chat. Thank you again so much, Shannon. Always wonderful to see you, and I hope we can maybe do this again next year as well.
I'll be around.
We'll find a new topic or the same topic. That would be great. And thanks everyone for coming. Such a great turnout today. Um, so please join me in, virtually thanking Shannon in whatever way you can do that from your end. And there are some things upcoming that folks might be interested in, so I'll put those into the chat. I will also send a follow-up email. Actually, I'm gonna let the thank yous come in first. Let's take those in first.
I'm trying to put a heart by everyone, but it's going to take a little bit. So
Yes,
please,
that's
heart
right.
is implied.
Uh, we have on March 10th a natural dine-in weaving workshop. Weaving wool workshop at KPU Surrey. You simply email me to get on the list for that. It's only open to 12 folks, so let me know sooner rather than later if you're interested in attending that one. March 26th, we have a book club on Leanne Simpson's intriguing book, Theory of Water. That's open to everyone, KPU or otherwise. So there is a link. Oh, let me put the link in for the book club as well, in case you want to register for that. And to find more details on these and other upcoming events hosted or co-hosted by Wild Spaces, there is the link to our events page where you can find several coming up in the next month or two. Thank you everybody for coming, and thank you again, Shannon. So much richness to take away from our session here today.
Absolutely delighted. And thank you everyone for listening. Sometimes it gets sidetracked, but today I think was okay. Take care, everyone. We'll see you again soon.